Great to see you, Andreas. Thank you so much for joining us again today. We're thrilled to sit down with you again and pick your brain just to hear the latest on what's happening in the world of work. Of course, some of the words that are in the zeitgeist seemingly these days are around efficiency, how we're maintaining collaboration in distributed environments. So we're going to dig into all that and more, but thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Tom.
Excellent. And so let's start it off maybe with one question about efficiency in this distributed environment that we're all operating in nowadays. What do you think are some of the misconceptions about hybrid work that you think leaders really need to unlearn or
Yeah.
will become maybe quickly antiquated as the velocity of change keeps accelerating?
Yeah, I think definitely one misconception that needs to be unlearned, especially when you talk about velocity change, the current operating environment that we're in, nationally, globally, is this idea that when people are in office, that naturally creates collaboration, coordination, and better decision making. I think we can all be, we've all experienced that just coming into space doesn't resolve all these big issues. They didn't resolve the issues pre-2020. So when we come in, we need to be really intentional about how we connect different individuals, and then really think about how do we connect strategically adjacent teams that might have a dependency one or two steps down the value generation stream. How can we make sure that there's a lot of connections between those? Maybe not for the tasks that are at hand that day, but when thinking about if we have to flex really quickly, how can we make sure that those people have those relationships so that they can work better together?
Yeah, very much agree with that. And we all know that there are a lot of inefficiencies, I think, in the way that many companies and leaders are approaching distributed work. But is there anything that's really standing out to you on things that are working really well and actually achieving a more productive, engaged workforce?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll hit that from two fronts. On the side of, what are some serious inefficiencies that are holding organizations back from really being effective and leading globally distributed teams or hybrid workforces, even if they're locally based, is oftentimes from the inefficiency front is that we start to look at other organizations and try to kind of lift and shift strategies. And I think it's good to know what's happening in your environment, but what's authentic to your organization is going to be different than another organization. So really thinking about how can we start to collect internal data where we see organizations that are really thriving is that they're constantly pulsing employees. So they're not just doing one annual survey, but they're asking maybe every week or every 2 weeks, one or two simple questions to their employees so that they can constantly gauge where are things at, how are things working, what are some strategies that we've implemented, how is that actually being felt on the ground. And the way that I like compare that is imagine you ran a marathon and you only looked at your finish time at the end of the race, and that was your only gauge of your success that day. You have this one static point in time that doesn't really help you move forward or as you're trying to think about that race. So if you're constantly getting data, like if you're wearing a watch and every mile it's telling you how you're doing, you can now adjust to not only your own pace, also just what's happening in the environment. Maybe things are happening that you need to adjust your rhythm, your cadence to. So being able to constantly pulse employees, we find that actually helps employers a lot more in creating strategies that work really well, both for employees and for the business operations.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, because sometimes there's just a big divide, I think, between what leaders perceive to be the case versus what employees on the front lines would actually tell you. And so getting that, milestone feedback or feedback along the way, I think can, really help, minimize that gap between perception and sort of ground level reality. We all know that it's sometimes a little bit tough, though, to get folks to actually give you that input,
Yeah.
to use those listening tools. I'm curious what your thoughts are on maybe tackling that challenge, but also maybe even the same question applied more broadly to just the collaboration and tools in general. We know that there's this preponderance of technology that's meant to help people connect, for them to stay engaged, to increase their collaboration. But because there's so much out there, sometimes it feels like when there's so many places to go, you don't go anywhere, right? And a lot of the stuff doesn't get used to the degree that I think we don't like it to be or that it should. So what are some of the maybe things that you would seeing as working well for getting folks to give you that information, but then also use the broader tools in the ecosystem?
Of course. I think from the side of how do you get people to use, or how do you get people to respond to your questions? How do you get survey data? Oftentimes what we find is organizations that really struggle to get to any meaningful threshold of response rates is because they're not reporting back that data to employees. It becomes this opaque hole where I'm submitting my feedback, it goes somewhere, and I have no idea what's happened with this. I don't know if someone's read it. I don't know if somebody's going to actually implement strategy around that, or what that feedback is. Where we get 90, 95% response rates is organizations that are really transparent about their data. Obviously, not everything is given. Obviously, there's anonymity and there's a recognition that not everything can be changed, but here's where we're at. This is the data that we collected. This is what it's telling us, and providing that in a really timely cycle. And then also, well, how do we want to act on this? So making a commitment not only to share data back in a way that employees can understand that they want to be heard. So if we're not showing that data back, they feel like they're not being heard. And eventually, if you submit so many customer reviews or feedback forms and you never see anything out of it, you're going to stop doing it. It's the same in an organization. So if we have a policy around how we respond back to that data, how we actually communicate, how we're thinking about it, how we're actually going to develop strategy to overcome challenges that are surfaced in that data, that's when we see higher response rates. But that also takes time, right? Like if you've had a culture of opaque data and not really showing stuff up and coming up in these annual reviews and in these really choppy ways, you're going to have to do a few pulses to show that through your actions or the organization's actions that they're going to start to share that data and really meaningfully take that into account so that the voices of employees are heard. From the other question on how do you now get people to adopt all these new tools, I think the abundance question is a real big problem, right? There's so many tools out there. When we have different teams using different technologies, different functions, different regions, it creates a lot of noise and an inability to create that network effect. But I think what's more challenging for organizations that we see is there's so much thoughtfulness put into selecting a tool, whatever that might be, a tool, a product, a service. There's so much pre-work that goes into selecting that, vetting it, testing it, and then bringing it into the organization. And then what typically happens? There's maybe an email, an internal comms, it falls in someone's email, and no blame on the individual. I mean, there's so much work that some of these emails, they just get overlooked. And then what happens, almost in a best case scenario, people don't know about it. In a worst case scenario, people are told about this. They don't see any of their colleagues using these tools. And then all of a sudden they're building up this mental barrier saying, well, nobody else is using this. So maybe it doesn't work. Maybe there's an inefficiency. Maybe I'm going to be frowned upon for using this. So we essentially have created an artificial barrier for adoption where we see organization thrive when it comes to, new tools, new behaviors, new policies. It's when they test it in areas where there's they know that they're going to get good adoption rates. They know that they're going to get those early adopters. They do that in a closed environment and then show the proof, the legitimacy, the efficacy of this tool. Because when we want to change people's behaviors, we want them to adopt something. We want them to learn new technology. We want them to integrate that into their workflows. They need to see social proof of that, right? So many of the tools that we ask people to adopt, they don't just catch on like a contagion as we would like to in many instances. So we have to do that pre-work. And once you build up that critical mass, you can show out the proof, the legitimacy, and the efficacy. That's when we start to see these cascades. And it's a bit counterintuitive to the normal approach that we'd think about, but that's when we typically see greater adoption rates.
No, that's super, super helpful. And I fully agree. It's, there needs to be that network effect of sorts where I see people do that. I see them have some impact. That's what's going to encourage me much more than some communication coming down saying, hey, here's this thing, it's available.
Yeah.
And so let's stay on this vein of tech and work for a moment. And obviously we have to go there in these days, but just thinking about AI, thinking about, talk about a preponderance of new tech solutions that have emerged over the last 30, 60, 90 days even. It's pretty, I don't know if I've ever seen anything like this before in my life. And there's a lot of, I think, excitement about this wave of new technology. There's also some hesitation and maybe even fear around AI in the workplace. And maybe not just from the perspective of, oh, AI is going to take my job potentially, but beyond that. But I'm curious, in what ways do you realistically think? There's a lot of, I think, sort of grand projections. Bill Gates was saying, a couple of days ago that doctors and teachers will be obsolete in 10 years, right? But realistically, and maybe that is realistic, I don't know. He's probably smarter than I am. But do you think that hybrid work in particular, or just sort of the way we work, how will that be most impacted from your perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thinking about how does AI impact hybrid work, organizations at large, I think that when we start to think about the 5 year out from a human relationship standpoint, I think that as technology, AI, the models get a lot better at making the kind of discrete tasks, they're less messy, automating them, we get a lot of leverage in our work. And we can start to do work that's more meaningful, higher value to organizations. That's all been said before, where I think organizations are really going to thrive and where AI will really provide new avenues for organizations is really this need to think about human relationships, because those kind of messy problems in organizations that are really hard to solve, that's where we're going to need a lot of brain power, a lot of people coming together. And I think it's going to require us to think about organizations more nimbly and think about new assemblages of people coming from different departments, functions, regions, teams coming together to solve those really complex tasks that AI can't help us with. So I think it's going to make organizations think more about how do we create a really robust network of individuals that can fluently operate across borders, geographies, disciplines, areas, because we're seeing more organizations now in the last 6 to 8 months saying, we need to think more globally around how we operate. There's so many more shocks coming in from geopolitical, economics, so where we were able to operate one day, the next day we can't, or now there's like barriers right now where we need to operate in different markets, and that requires a more fluidity in their workforce. So it's a great opportunity when you have hybrid, globally distributed teams, but then we need to make sure that they're connected, because you can never think about, or no organization has that crystal ball that can predict what's going to happen in the future, but the ones that have really robust networks, ones that are really well connected, those are the ones that can act on those opportunities really quickly and also avoid or at least insulate themselves from shocks that are unanticipated in their markets or their geographies or wherever they're operating.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like you believe, and this is, I think, maybe a little bit counterintuitive to where we think the market is, that the technology will have the most impact in actually facilitating that connection.
Yeah.
Because I can tell you that a lot of the companies I speak with, engage with, are worried that too much technology can almost dehumanize the employee experience to an extent. And there's the struggle to balance the right amount of digital efficiency with real connection. Mm-hmm. But it seems like you don't have as much of a concern there. You actually think it can be a driver.
Yeah, I definitely think it's a driver. If an organization sees it as a catalyst to offload those lower hanging tasks and really enable people to do real complex problem solving in multidisciplinary ways, that it's going to demand more human relationships, more human connections. So in that sense, I think it's really enabling. But we also, like you said, have to balance too much technology in the workplace with how do we create those connections, right? We've all jumped on Zoom calls where it seems very efficient and effective to jump to tasks. And then you find out when you ask those teams that have worked together now for 18 months purely on Zoom, do you know anything about your colleague? Yeah. No. Does it feel transactional? Yes. Then you get them together just for a day or two where they can get to know one another from a more human level, from a non-work level. And all of a sudden, they become more effective employees. And we've seen in some organizations where we're looking at this productivity scores, effectiveness scores, retention, these metrics that are really important, they increase just by virtue of people creating that human connection. So making sure that we're balancing the efficiencies and the incredible gains that we can get by having a globally distributed work team and organization, but then also making sure that we're giving people those opportunities to create that human connection, because that ultimately will help us perform at that higher level and really muddle through those more complex tasks and those immediate demands that are, like you said, more and more prevalent today.
And it's interesting because it almost feels like maybe we've become too reliant on the tech to a certain degree. And we have an opportunity now to sort of revert back a little bit more towards that balanced mean. Yeah. And it was, I think, a natural consequence where we had to be relying on the tech in the midst of COVID. We don't have to be as much anymore, but maybe that's just an ingrained behavior at this point, given the last few years. But is there any technology that you do feel like we are using as a crutch or overly reliant on?
I think in many instances, we've all experienced this in organizations using Zooms when we're all in the same office or when we're all in the same city or when we could conceivably come together. I don't think that needs to happen every day. I don't think that needs to happen on every call, but finding some cadence where people can come together and actually have those moments of unstructured conversation, some more of that serendipitous conversation with their colleagues. So recognizing that we gain a lot by having video calls, having all the other technologies with us, but when we do have any type of concentrations of individuals in any cities, any areas, making sure that they're coming together so that they can have those touch points with one another.
And I would share that if you were to ask the folks on my team, they oftentimes will get annoyed because they'll slack and slack and slack, and oftentimes they'll get a phone call in response from me
Yeah.
to a Slack. And so even if we can't be together, I agree that I'm always trying to find ways to bring back that just organic interaction, that more, sort of human to human side of things, as opposed to just going through, Slacks and emails all the time, even when we can't be together live. But I completely agree.
Because we used to get that, right?
Yeah.
When we walked to an office or we walked to a meeting or whatever that was, we lost a lot of that because not everyone showed up synchronously at 100% at the same time, sat down and got to task. There was somebody who was early, there's somebody who was late. There's people who walked together in the halls. And while I'm not advocating that we go back to, a prior model, there's certainly something lost in that texture of human interaction. Seeing a photo that someone has on a desk, and whenever I go into offices and I'm working with folks, I'm always looking at what's in their environment, and you find those connection points, you see those elements about people that help you create a human to human connection. Find ways, like you're saying, even if you're just picking up the call and calling, getting somebody off guard and just, having a conversation with them about something non-work related, or starting calls that are maybe not jumping right to the agenda, but what did you do this weekend, or whatever doesn't feel cringy in the organization or for the team or for those folks together.
No, I mean, it's funny because, as efficient as tools like Slack and others can be, there's this tipping point at which it becomes less efficient, right? And 20 Slacks back and forth as opposed to a 2-minute conversation, is sort of where my mind goes at it. And then there's an opportunity. Again, this concept of like a little bit of a reversion back to the mean feels like where we're at.
Yeah, and recognizing that some of those, I think what you touched on there is so important, is there's things that can be communicated very effectively through Slack, email, video calls. Sometimes it is just being in someone's presence, being able to ask them a question, getting a sense of their feedback, which can be more, body language, how they react to it can be more important, or watching people around a table in a more organic way react to ideas, react to direction can be more important than any document can convey, any digital form can. So making sure that we're not losing those moments that are really critical for an organization to get that, just that when everyone's together, it's buy-in. And you and I have talked about this in many instances, when just having those strategy calls, when you're bringing people together, bring them in person, and that builds an excitement. And we know that we experience things very differently around one another than side by side on little boxes.
That's right. So shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk with our remaining time just about this concept of learning in a virtual environment, knowing that there's two forces happening, I think, but I'd love to get your thoughts. One, there's managers that have been managers for a long time, but they've managed in a certain kind of environment, and that environment doesn't really exist anymore. And so the old playbooks that they would rely on don't apply. And then you have a lot of brand new managers as folks come up the ranks and are promoted to front and mid-level management roles. And it always feels like that forgotten cohort, because when we hire a new employee as an IC, they tend to get a lot of training and support. Senior folks and executives tend to get a lot of training and support. But for me, those front and first-time managers, they tend to be the folks that are superstar ICs thrust into the role, and it's like, go figure it out. And so it used to be the case that those folks could maybe get some mentorship and support from the folks around them or adjacent to them, but they're not anymore, right? And even those folks, again, as I was saying in the beginning, their playbooks are becoming a little bit outdated in this sort of modern world of work. So any thoughts on that, or like what's the path forward, and sort of what role potentially does technology play in evolving how we learn and enable folks, particularly in a management capacity?
Yeah. How do you get those new managers, star ICs who are coming up, they become first time managers? How do we get them to get the same type of mentorship in an evolved or emerged workplace that we work in today? I think you hit on one of the most challenging transitions anyone, probably one of the most challenging transitions anyone does in their career, is going from an IC to a manager and having to change their role, understand what comes with that. And now we don't have potentially the mentors who are around us that we can just watch other people really be really effective managers to others, and we can start to emulate and model that behavior. And then the ones that we have, they were used to a different environment, and arguably that old environment didn't work for anyone, right? It worked really well for people who were, or worked for some, or worked for those individuals who were extroverts, right? Who felt really comfortable, who felt emboldened to go around, create connections, ask questions, go seek people out, pull on people and ask for stretch assignments. But that means that, a significant portion of our workforce wasn't getting the same opportunities. So I think one of the strategies that we can use as we're thinking about what are those L&D movements, how do we help structure that is identifying those individuals and clustering them in really meaningful ways where they're around similar tasks, and then finding leaders who have really performed well in this emerged environment. And that's sometimes finding those bright spots in the organization who have been really tremendous at acknowledging that there has been a shift. Typically, those were leaders who were already managing distributed teams across continents, working in whatever that flow is, where they've already had a touch point on this. Bring those people together just to share. You and I have spoken to folks who've done so successfully, where they bring in those emerging leaders and have them share out what's working really well, what isn't, because so many times what's working well is already happening within that organization. We just need to connect those people in a way that works for them. And we find works really well. It's not just connecting one-on-one, that's certainly helpful, but also as a group, also a community, right? When you go to a gym, it's always helpful to have people who are there to support you, to help you, keep you committed to it, especially when it gets really challenging, because we're talking about one of the most challenging transitions in a career. But then also, how can you support each other with feedback? Hey, I'm saying in one of my Cs, or I'm really struggling making this disconnect between being a star performer to now managing multiple emerging star performers. You have this great tactic, or you have this great way of doing one-on-ones. Let me just adopt that. So creating those moments for those individuals to come together, and where technology can help us with that is really identifying where are those bright spots within the organization, where are those individuals who are really thriving, that are maybe a bit more tenure, maybe one more level of responsibility above these emerging leaders that are now frontline managers. How can we connect them in a way that's meaningful for them, so it doesn't feel like, well, I'm connected to all these folks that I don't, their day-to-day looks so different than my day-to-day. So some of that copying and pasting won't work, but how can we find those communities organically within the organization?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And where we've been focusing our technology and development is really to helping organizations, rethink how they organize people when they're asked to come together.
Mm-hmm.
And we know nowadays, particularly for top talent, if you are going to ask them to make that investment of spending 3 hours to come into a space, that it needs to be a unique experience that can only be got in that space, right? And when I go there, I need to be surrounded with the people with whom I'm actually working with and collaborating with, or that I'm going to have some unique type of, could be sponsorship or mentorship or learning type interaction. But that's really, really hard to coordinate at scale using the methods of planning that we used to do when everybody was in 5 days a week, right? Yeah. And so when folks are scattered about in hybrid, environments, and people can live lots of different places, one of the areas that we're seeing is, the ability to use tech to, sort of scan across the organization, understand who those bright spots are, who are they near, right? Who's working with who, and then coordinating people inside a space in a way that maximizes on that. So it's not just serendipitous that those moments happen, and yes, they will, right? Just organically. But what we're learning is that they can be engineered in a sense. They can be manufactured to occur based on how we think about communities and think about organizing folks in spaces. But any thoughts that you have?
Yeah. Arguably, how people were getting together before wasn't working for organizations either. Silos poor decision making, slow decision making, projects that run over time, over budget, that none of that's new, right? We know that in so many organizations where you might have 10 floor plates, it's essentially a distributed workforce, and those people might not interact. So being more intentional, but scaling that, because oftentimes what we have is an org chart which tells us the structure and adjacencies of functions and teams, but it doesn't really tell us how they work. It doesn't tell us how they operate. And especially pulsing when we're thinking about from the start of the project to the end of the project, how value is generated at one time of the year versus another, or another cycle of the business, how the organization works is very different, and it becomes very hard to manage from just looking at it from an org structure. So being able to understand what are the flows of communication, what are the flows of interactions, who needs to be interacting with whom now, making sure that we can bring those people in adjacent spaces so that when we're saying, hey, come in and have these meetings, have these intentional connections, that they're actually around people where that becomes really value add. And it's never a bad thing to be connected to somebody in a very different part of an organization. I think that there's incredible value in that, and we know that. But we need to make sure if we want to hit targets and outcomes, is that we're making sure that those strategically adjacent teams and functions are coming together at the right time. And you bring up another point: when we have people in different places, you and I might be on the same team, but in very different places. But if I'm getting together with somebody who might need you and they know me by virtue of we've been together, we've created that connection, they might ask me, hey, I need to get in touch with Tom or somebody who knows this on your team. And I can right away, I can be the person who becomes that bridge between you two. And by virtue of you two knowing me, it helps you to work together more effectively, more quickly. So if we think about how do we increase the pace of business, achieving outcomes, we also need to make sure we're connecting different people from different places so that they can find each other in a way that's quicker than pinging through a network and creating a bunch of noise on Slack, just trying to find somewhere, find a piece of information.
Couldn't agree more. So this has been an amazing. We're going to leave it there for today, but it's been great to sit down with you again and to hear the latest and what's going on in your world, and look forward to our next chat soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Tom.